So it's a little early where I'm at, so I might speak a lot slower because I just woke up. But this lecture came to my mind, and it's from 1969. It's called The Game of Life. Now, I have two versions that, for some reason, do have different words to them. And in one lecture, I think there's an important point. In the other lecture, I think there's an important point. So I'm going to try to go over both of them. But they're roughly almost identical, but just a few things here and there are different. And and I might make this into a two-part. I'm not sure. It depends on how long it goes. But he starts off this idea of the game of life and how, in a sense, God or the imagination is the referee, and the game. He gives you a few rules. He takes it from Scripture, and one of the rules is that whatsoever you desire, believe you have it, and you will, and that's one of the rules you should play by. And really, he says the people who lose this game are people who are unaware of these rules. And he also gives another rule. He takes it from Ecclesiastes. And if you haven't read Ecclesiastes, I would recommend you read it because it goes into the idea of life ultimately is meaningless without this act of salvation or redemption. But the rule in Ecclesiastes that he gives is, even in your thought, do not curse the king, nor in your bedchamber curse the rich, for a bird will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. And then and he goes on. I'm going to go on what he means by that rule in a second. But the other rule that he gives from Ecclesiastes is this: which is, cast your bread upon waters, for you shall have it after many days. Now, the cast your bread upon waters, in one lecture I have, he speaks about how this has nothing to do with, like, some people think that scripture has to do with being good in the world and trying to be a good person. Well, although you can do that, that's not really what it's speaking about. In this other lecture that I was reading, he says that it's really not about that. It's about just doing it. You just cast your bread upon waters. And it's more about simply imagining it, because he goes into how the bread is a metaphor for devouring, for consuming, and water is a euphemism for semen. And it's really just means a psychological act. But he's not saying that it's about being good. It's about just doing it. Just imagine it. And really what he means by that is being passionate about what you're imagining, become intense about it. And when you read these lectures, remember, a lot of this has nothing to do with the physical reality. It really views it as a shadow, that it's first done in imagination. That is what a lot of these lectures and scriptures are speaking about. So when it says don't curse the king, it doesn't mean like don't speak a cursed word upon the king. It has to do with really more of an attitude of mind within yourself. Because he goes on to say that really the kings and rich people are seen as what people envy the most in this world. But really these are symbols. Doesn't mean a literal king. It just means somebody who has more authority than you, or somebody who has somebody doesn't have to be a billionaire for you to be jealous of them. It could be them having a nicer home, or some being in a better neighborhood. It's all relative, right? But in a sense, somebody you're jealous of their authority or power over you, that's a king in your world. That's all it means. Or somebody who has something a little bit more than you. I've seen this before. You see people compete with neighbors will compete this way. Somebody will buy a nice car and the other one will buy a nice car, and then they just try to buy all these toys to compete with each other. That is sort of, in a sense, scripture's kind of against that idea. You shouldn't be worried about what another person's doing. It should be more about, instead of cursing somebody around you who you think has more than you, assume that you have it. Assume that you are in the state you want to be in. And then in one of the lectures, I'll just say lecture 1, he says this. He says, let me put it this way. The game of life is won by those who compare their thoughts and feelings within what appears on the outside. And the game is lost by those who do not recognize this law. Being consumed by anger, they see no change in their world. But if they were to change their mood, their circumstances would change. And then they would recognize the law behind their world. Then he goes on to how in his own personal life, Neville's, he said that when he was back in New York, because at this time he was in Los Angeles, he would walk around the streets, and at that time he would bump into a lot of his friends, because New York's kind of more of a smaller space than Los Angeles, and he would actively avoid people who would come to him with depressing stories. He says he just knew people who were constantly giving him sort of a story of where something wrong is happening constantly. And he said he just didn't want to be sort of surrounded or around it anymore. And so he would actively try to avoid them. And he goes, they just can't see a connection between how they are and how their world is. And so they stay the same. Now, that can be challenging to hear when you otherwise are in that mood. but but I understand it. You want to spend some time thinking about what is happening within me and also what's happening outside of me. And is there a link there? And if I were to change what's within me, does it actually reflect on the outside of me? And Neville says, the people might think this is stupid. He's like, you might think this whole game is stupid, and it might be stupid, but like that's the game. I never thought of it as stupid, to be honest. I never thought that. It actually made a lot of sense to me that the connection would be as within, so without first. That always made sense to me. I just had no direction nor way of changing my inner world. I didn't know how to do that. But I always had that in the back of my mind, that what I'm doing within me matters. I always knew that. But it didn't. But just knowing it, as I said in the first video, you can know imagining creates reality. You can know this and give lip service to it, but it doesn't mean you're actually practicing it. And he speaks about this in this lecture, that this is, a friend said this to me. He goes, that this is like the simplest thing, but the most difficult thing to practice, because it's so simple. What is happening within me is also happening without. And being sort of in discipline about what you're doing inside of yourself can be a challenge. But he says it just takes some time to get used to it. He speaks about how we're playing this game morning, noon, and night, and you can be in a strong habit of sort of what we've talked about, thinking things that otherwise aren't fulfillments, thinking of sort of complaining about why we don't have what we want. He says that, this doesn't really work if you are in a constant state of complaining about how you don't have enough of this or enough of that. And it can be difficult to be around people too, as well, who always are complaining. I mean, even as well for me, speaking for my own, just self-reflecting, I was difficult to be around when I was constantly complaining. And complaining never got me anywhere. It just didn't, not inside of myself. The only ways I've ever moved inside is what we do, is what we assume. We assume we already are the thing inside. That's how we move. That's the only way to play the game effectively, that I've noticed. To be actually a good player on this field is to really imagine from the state. What did he say? He said, it doesn't work under compulsion. It works under fulfillment. When you have imagined the wish fulfilled, that's when imagination starts to work in your life, not under compulsion. So you can become scared and try to imagine with all your might, but it doesn't seem to work that way. It seems to work when you imagine the wish fulfilled. When you go to the end, that's where you begin, and that's where things start to unfold. And he goes on to say, you can imagine something, and then a few seconds, just because it hasn't proven itself in performance yet, you can just let go of it and forget it. He goes, you don't really hold on to it or sustain it because it just hasn't appeared yet in your world. And that's probably one of the most common things you see here. So it requires a sense of patience, and it requires a sense of patience and persistence, right? Because you are imagining something, and although it hasn't appeared yet, you remain loyal to what you've imagined, what you've experienced inside. You remain loyal to that. And although the days go by, you persist in your loyalty. You don't give up on it just because it hasn't appeared yet. And loyalty to the unseen is what makes things become seen. And so it's better to play the game instead of complain about the game. It's a challenging game. It is, but it's also one that's really rewarding. He goes on to say that, you can discipline your mind. He goes, if you want to imagine a chair. He goes, just sit on the chair and try to feel the chair. Try to feel that you're sitting on the chair and view the world from that chair. He goes, if you start to see life in imagination, while you're in imagination, on that level from that chair, you must be there. Remember what he said? He goes, imagination's my real self. So where I am in imagination is where I am, and this is a shadow. And so he goes, and then he just says this, but I almost think of it as a quote. He said, a way of living. He goes, if I would go on a boat in my imagination, then on a boat I must become. So I always view that as one day it's imaginary, the next day it's reality. I don't mean that in the most literal 24-hour sense. I mean that as a way of living, that although it's imaginary now, it will appear in the flesh in this world. If I were to go on a boat I must become. So I've always seen that as that to me sort of wraps this game of life in a more of a poetic way. more of a beautiful way of seeing it. So if you imagine yourself somewhere, you trust that you are there. You have to be. If your imagination is your real self, you're not split from it. That's Jacob. Remember, you're practicing Jacob. You're not split from that. These are different visions that you have. It all ties together when you see this that way. And so this is going to be part 1 here. I'll post part 2 tomorrow, so you guys can keep a lookout for it. And I also just want to let everybody know, I also do live talking. I sort of, in a sense, host a community for this kind of work. So if that interests you, love to have you. And it's all in the description if you need any more information on it. But again, thank you guys for listening.